The courtroom murmured with the low hum of morning chatter, the shuffle of papers, the echo of heels against the polished floor, the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. And then she entered. A young woman, mid-20s at best, sauntered in as though the courtroom were an inconvenience, not a place of justice. Her phone glowed in her hand, thumbs scrolling carelessly through a feed that mattered more than her case. A faint pop echoed as she chewed her gum, her eyes never rising to meet the solemn faces that surrounded her. The bailiff's voice broke through the calm, deep and commanding, calling her name with precision and authority. Case number 218, the City of Providence versus Miss Carter. But she didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even look up. Judge Caprio, seated high behind his bench, adjusted his glasses and lifted his gaze slowly from the papers before him. His expression was unreadable, steady, patient, the kind of calm that carried more weight than anger ever could. Across the room, a quiet tension began to rise. The clerk exchanged a quick glance with the officer standing nearby. Even the audience, used to seeing hundreds of cases move briskly through these walls, felt the air grow heavy with quiet disapproval. Finally, with a deliberate sigh, the bailiff repeated the name. This time, she looked up, half a smirk curling at the edge of her lips. "Yeah, that's me," she said, as though announcing herself at a casual gathering. Her tone carried an undercurrent of mockery, a hint of defiance that rippled through the courtroom. Caprio leaned back slightly, studying her. She walked toward the defendant's stand with exaggerated slowness, eyes rolling as she passed the officer who had issued her citation. He nodded courteously. She didn't return the gesture. "Good morning," Judge Caprio began, his voice gentle yet firm. "Are you ready to begin your case?" She shrugged. Sure. Let's get this over with." The words hung in the air like an unwelcome echo. Caprio's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in careful observation. He folded his hands and paused for what felt like an eternity. "You know," he said finally, his tone even, "most people come in here hoping for understanding. You seem eager to leave." A brief laugh escaped her lips, the kind that said she didn't take this place seriously. The courtroom, once lively, fell into utter silence. You could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Caprio's gaze didn't waver. His calm was unsettling, almost surgical in its precision. When he spoke again, his words were deliberate, measured. "Miss," he said, voice low, "are you sure you want to start your morning this way?" The smirk faded just a little, her gum slowing between her teeth. The faint flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as the judge's steady tone broke through her armor of arrogance. The crowd sensed it, the first small crack. Somewhere, near the back, an elderly woman shifted in her seat, whispering softly. He's giving her a chance. And he was, because this courtroom, though wrapped in law and order, had always been more than a place of punishment. It was a place of reckoning. Caprio leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench, eyes still locked on hers. His silence said what words could not. "This isn't about a parking ticket. It's about respect." She blinked, as if trying to read him, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. Judge Caprio tapped his pen once against the desk and nodded subtly toward the clerk. "All right," he said evenly. "Let's proceed." The tension didn't break. It merely shifted, turning from defiance to curiosity. The stage was set, not for a verdict, but for a lesson she didn't yet know she was about to learn. The air in the courtroom felt different now, charged, restless, almost electric. Miss Carter stood at the defendant's podium, one hand on her hip, the other still clutching her phone. Judge Caprio watched her quietly, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate, You're here today for a parking violation issued on Broad Street. Do you understand the nature of the citation?" She tilted her head, smirking. "Yeah, I got a ticket. Big deal." Her tone sliced through the quiet room, drawing a few uneasy glances from the spectators. The clerk cleared her throat softly, trying to move things along. "Please confirm for the record that you were parked in a no-parking zone." But Miss Carter wasn't done. She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on. It was 5 minutes. You guys must be desperate for money if this is what counts as justice." The clerk blinked, speechless. Across the room, an officer shifted his weight uncomfortably. The courtroom, normally a place of order, began to feel like a stage for mockery. Judge Caprio didn't interrupt. He simply adjusted his glasses and leaned back, allowing the silence to stretch. It was the kind of silence that demanded reflection, but Miss Carter mistook it for weakness. "You must get bored, huh?" she said suddenly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Judging parking tickets all day doesn't exactly scream excitement." A few audible gasps rippled through the benches. Even the camera operator paused his motion, sensing something monumental about to unfold. For a moment, Caprio didn't move. His eyes lowered to the file in front of him, then slowly lifted back to meet hers. His expression was calm, but the stillness around him carried the weight of authority, the kind that didn't need to shout to command respect. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder now. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost gentle. "Miss," he said, "you may not realize it yet, but every person who stands here, every story, every struggle, means something. There are no small cases, only small attitudes." His words weren't angry. They were deliberate, almost surgical, cutting through her bravado. But she wasn't ready to surrender. She rolled her eyes again, scoffing under her breath. The clerk tried to regain control of the proceedings. "Your Honor," she began. But Caprio raised a single hand, stopping her without looking away from the defendant. The judge's calm was unnerving now, the kind that made everyone else hold their breath. "I've been doing this for a long time," he continued softly. "Long enough to know that when someone mocks this court, they're not laughing at the law. They're usually running from something inside themselves." For the first time, the smirk faltered. Miss Carter shifted, her confidence dimming beneath the weight of his words. The audience leaned in. You could feel the tension tightening like a string pulled too far. Judge Caprio folded his hands and gave her one last measured look. His silence now said more than any reprimand could. It wasn't the pause of frustration. It was the pause of a teacher waiting for a lesson to land. Somewhere near the back, a man whispered, "He's not mad. He's teaching her." The room seemed to exhale in unison, sensing that something profound was about to follow. Caprio straightened slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to assert his power. The quiet itself was his gavel. The young woman blinked, caught in a silence that felt heavier than any punishment. And as the echoes of her own words lingered in the air, everyone knew this clash was only the beginning. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the bench, eyes calm yet piercing. The courtroom was silent, as if even the walls knew what was coming. He spoke softly at first, the tone of a man who had seen thousands of faces walk through those doors, some broken, some angry, some lost. "Miss Carter," he began, "you know, this courtroom isn't just about parking tickets or fines. It's about something much bigger. It's about respect for the law, for the people who serve it, and for yourself." His voice carried no judgment, only truth. The young woman tilted her head, unimpressed, her gums still moving slowly between her teeth. He continued, his words deliberate, each one placed like a stone on sacred ground. When you walk into this courtroom, you're not standing before me. You're standing before the institution of justice. Long before I sat here, this bench represented fairness. It represented accountability. It represents the idea that every person, no matter who they are, deserves to be heard. But they must also listen. The quiet echo of his voice lingered, and for a brief moment, you could feel the weight of history in the room. But she only chuckled under her breath, a sound so careless it cut through the air like a paper slice. "You're really making a big deal out of this, huh?" she said, glancing around the courtroom as if seeking someone to agree with her. The audience didn't move. Some looked away. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Caprio sat perfectly still. He didn't raise his voice, didn't change expression. Instead, he leaned back and took a slow breath. That calm, unshakable, patient, was more commanding than any outburst could ever be. "Miss," he said finally, "I've been doing this for decades. I've seen anger, sorrow, frustration, and remorse. But arrogance, that's a dangerous one. Because arrogance blinds you to wisdom when it's right in front of you." His tone wasn't scolding. It was reflective, almost paternal. She crossed her arms, smirking again, though her confidence was thinning. "I'm just saying, it's a parking ticket," she muttered, rolling her eyes. Caprio nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth tightening, not in anger, but in a kind of quiet sadness. "Yes, it's a parking ticket. But how we treat the small things," he said, pausing to look directly into her eyes, "reveals how we'll handle the big ones." The courtroom remained hushed. Even the camera crew leaned forward slightly, sensing something human unfolding, something bigger than the case itself. The woman scoffed again, trying to shake off the moment. "Whatever," she said, but her voice trembled just enough for those paying attention to notice. Caprio's expression softened, and when he spoke next, it was almost a whisper. "You know," he said, his eyes steady and kind, "every court teaches a lesson. Let's see what yours will be." He didn't need to say more. The words hung in the air, filling the room with quiet anticipation. Her smirk faded into silence as Caprio turned slightly toward the clerk, the sound of papers rustling breaking the stillness. The gavel hadn't struck yet, but everyone knew something had shifted. The courtroom clock ticked softly in the silence after her last remark. Judge Caprio studied her with a long, unreadable expression before finally leaning back in his chair. "Let's take a short recess," he said calmly, his tone steady but carrying an undertone no one could quite place. The bailiff nodded, and as the judge stood, the defendant let out a faint, almost mocking sigh of relief, muttering something under her breath that only the clerk caught. The audience whispered among themselves as the judge disappeared through the side door, his robe swaying slightly behind him. 10 minutes later, when the court reconvened, the air felt heavier, different, almost cinematic in its stillness. Miss Carter stood at the podium again, arms crossed. She was expecting another lecture, maybe another moral speech. But this time, Judge Caprio didn't speak right away. He tapped his pen lightly, then nodded toward the bailiff. "Let's play the footage," he said quietly. A monitor flickered to life beside the bench. The camera zoomed in on a street corner, Broad Street, a cloudy afternoon. There she was, clear as day, stepping out of her car parked right in front of a bright red, "No parking anytime" sign. The courtroom watched in near silence as the video played. The audio crackled with the officer's voice approaching her. "Ma'am, you can't park here," he said politely. On screen, Miss Carter laughed, an exaggerated, dismissive laugh. "Oh, come on," she said to the officer, waving him off. "Go write someone else a ticket. Don't you have real criminals to chase?" Her words hung in the air, echoing now in a courtroom that suddenly felt smaller. The audience shifted uncomfortably. The officer in the video remained calm, issuing the ticket as she continued to taunt him. Yeah, whatever," she'd said, climbing back into her car. "Enjoy your power trip." Judge Caprio didn't move as the video ended. The screen went black, but its silence was louder than anything that had come before. Miss Carter's smirk had vanished. Her arms dropped from their crossed position, and her eyes darted to the floor. You could almost hear her heartbeat in the quiet. The camera lingered on her face, the same face that had mocked the process minutes earlier, now stripped of its defiance. The audience sat frozen, some shaking their heads slowly. Even the clerk, who had remained professional throughout, glanced briefly at the defendant with quiet disapproval. Caprio leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, fingers interlaced. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "That's you, isn't it?" She nodded faintly, unable to meet his eyes. "Do you still think this is about boredom?" His tone wasn't sharp, but it carried weight. Ancient, deliberate weight. She tried to speak, but the words caught somewhere between pride and shame. I didn't mean." "You did," Caprio interrupted gently. "And that's okay. We all make mistakes. The question is, do we learn from them?" Her breathing grew uneven. The gum she'd been chewing was gone. Her lips pressed together, trembling slightly. Every eye in the courtroom stayed on her, but the judge's gaze never hardened. It remained compassionate, fatherly even. He let the silence work its magic, knowing that sometimes the absence of judgment teaches more than judgment itself. He leaned back finally, giving her a moment to breathe. The courtroom remained still, heavy with unspoken truth. Judge Caprio's calm had become something else entirely, a mirror, one that reflected her own choices back at her, unfiltered. The defendant swallowed hard, and in that moment, realization began to flicker across her face. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a classroom, and the lesson had only just begun. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, long enough to make the ticking clock above the bench sound like a heartbeat. Miss Carter stood frozen, the weight of her own actions pressing down heavier than any fine could. Her once defiant posture had wilted, her hands fidgeted with the hem of her jacket. Judge Caprio remained still, his gaze gentle but unrelenting. "Go ahead," he said softly. "I'm listening." There was no accusation in his tone, no anger, only patience, which somehow felt even harder to face. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat visible as she tried to find words. I don't know what to say," she began, her voice thin. "I wasn't trying to be rude." Caprio didn't respond. He simply waited. That silence, his greatest tool, drew out what pride had tried to hide. Her voice wavered. I was having a bad week, okay?" She looked up briefly, eyes glistening. Everything felt like it was falling apart. My job, my car, my rent. And then that officer gave me that ticket, and it just... She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. It felt like the world was laughing at me. A murmur rippled through the gallery, soft and sympathetic. Caprio didn't move, didn't blink. His listening was a kind of mercy, a safe space where truth could breathe. She wiped a tear quickly, trying to recover her composure, but the dam had cracked. "I shouldn't have said what I said," she whispered, her tone stripped of the bravado it once held. "I was angry at everything, and took it out on someone who didn't deserve it." Judge Caprio leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. His eyes carried that same patient warmth that had disarmed thousands before her. "We all have bad weeks," he said quietly. "But how we face them shows who we are." His words landed gently, not as reprimand, but as understanding. The woman nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "I know," she said. I guess I forgot how to respect people when I stopped respecting myself. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to lower their gaze. The courtroom, once filled with tension, softened. Caprio's voice remained calm, measured. "You can't control your circumstances," he said, his tone deep and deliberate. "But you can control your respect." The line hung in the air, sinking into her like sunlight through a storm cloud. Tears spilled freely now, not from fear, but from release. Caprio gave her a small nod, letting the silence speak again. He didn't gloat, didn't lecture. He simply watched a human being rediscover humility in real time. She sniffled, brushing a tear away with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Truly." The judge's eyes softened further. "That's a good start," he replied. His tone wasn't congratulatory. It was hopeful, like a father seeing a child take the first step toward something better. The woman lowered her gaze, exhaling as though a weight had been lifted. Around the courtroom, the air felt lighter. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet stillness behind. Caprio looked down at his papers again, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All right," he said gently, his gavel resting still. "Let's see where we go from here." Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of the courtroom filling the quiet that followed her apology. Miss Carter stood trembling, her shoulders drawn in, her earlier bravado completely dissolved. For a long moment, Caprio said nothing. He simply studied her, the way her hands twisted nervously, the way her eyes avoided his. Finally, he spoke, his tone even and gentle. "Miss Carter," he began, "you've had your say. Now it's my turn." The room stilled. Even the soft rustle of papers stopped. Everyone waited for the verdict they assumed was coming. "I could fine you," he continued, "for the ticket, for your attitude, for wasting the court's time." Her eyes dropped lower with every word. "And truthfully," he added, "you'd probably deserve it." A murmur rippled through the benches. But that's not what this courtroom is for. It's not about breaking people down. It's about helping them stand taller when they leave. He paused, letting the meaning sink in. "So, here's what we're going to do." Miss Carter looked up, uncertain. Caprio's gaze softened, the edges of authority giving way to something deeply human. "The fine will be reduced," he said slowly. "But you're going to earn it." The audience leaned in. She blinked, confused. "Earn it?" she repeated quietly. "Yes," Caprio nodded. "I'm assigning you 20 hours of community service at the Providence Youth Center. You'll be working with kids who are growing up fast and sometimes angry. Maybe you can teach them what you learned here today." A hush fell over the courtroom. It wasn't the outcome anyone had expected. The woman stood speechless, her mouth slightly open as she tried to process his words. Caprio adjusted his glasses and continued. "I believe you meant what you said earlier, that you were having a hard week. But life doesn't get better because the world softens. It gets better when you do. Let's start there." His words carried warmth, not punishment, and the quiet compassion in his tone washed over the room like a gentle wave. Miss Carter's lips trembled. She nodded faintly, her voice barely audible. You're not fining me?" Caprio smiled. "You've already paid a bigger price, Miss Carter, one that money can't measure." His words drew soft smiles from those seated behind her, and even the bailiff lowered his gaze, as if moved by the judge's quiet mercy. Tears glimmered in her eyes now. She pressed a hand to her chest, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't forget this." Caprio gave a small nod, his expression steady. "That's all I ask," he said. "Don't forget it. Live it." For a fleeting second, The courtroom felt like a sanctuary, where justice met compassion and judgment became redemption. The judge reached for his gavel, tapping it softly once, not as a punishment, but as a benediction. The sound echoed like closure. "Case dismissed," he said gently, "and life lesson granted." Miss Carter exhaled deeply, her relief visible. The courtroom began to move again, papers rustling, whispers rising. But one truth lingered in the air. Sometimes, mercy is the loudest form of justice. Weeks passed, and the seasons began to shift. The hum of the city outside the courthouse carried on. Traffic horns, children's laughter, the rhythm of ordinary life continuing. Inside Judge Caprio's courtroom, a familiar name appeared again on the docket. Miss Carter. This time, though, she wasn't there to contest a ticket or defend her pride. She was there for something entirely different. The clerk set a small television monitor on the bench, pressing play on a video submitted by the Providence Youth Center. The lights dimmed slightly, and the room fell into expectant silence. On the screen, Miss Carter appeared, wearing a bright yellow vest, standing on a street corner, smiling as she helped a group of children cross safely. The camera zoomed in just enough to capture the sincerity in her face. Gone was the arrogance, the dismissive smirk. In its place was something lighter, softer, genuine peace. The kids waved up at her, their little hands clutching backpacks twice their size. She laughed, guiding them gently with a whistle and an outstretched arm. "All right, little ones, go make the world proud," she said, her voice full of warmth. The courtroom watched in silence. Some smiled, others blinked back tears. Even the officers seated along the back wall seemed moved, their stoic expressions softening. The footage cut to another clip, Miss Carter helping serve lunch at the youth center, kneeling to tie a boy's shoe, listening to a teenage girl talk about school. These small acts, once ordinary, now carried extraordinary weight. The audience could feel it, the power of humility reborn through kindness. As the video faded out, the courtroom lights brightened once more. Judge Caprio sat still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the now dark screen. Then he looked toward Miss Carter, standing beside the clerk's table, her eyes glistening with quiet pride. "You did your service?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Every hour of it, Your Honor. And more." A faint smile touched his face. "I can see that," he said. The audience chuckled gently, the sound light and genuine. Caprio leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying both gravitas and grace. "You see, Miss Carter, sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about opportunity. What you did for those kids, you gave them safety. But what they gave you was something even greater." She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "They gave me peace." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes warm. "Exactly." He glanced briefly toward the gallery, then back at her. "Sometimes," he said, pausing for a heartbeat, "mercy does more justice than punishment." The line lingered in the air, resonating beyond the walls of the courtroom. Miss Carter lowered her gaze, smiling through tears, as the sound of quiet applause filled the room. What had begun as defiance had turned into something far deeper: redemption. The courtroom was nearly empty now. The echo of footsteps faded down the marble hallway, leaving behind a quiet that felt sacred. Judge Caprio sat alone at the bench, the soft light from the tall windows washing across his face, half in shadow, half in gold. In front of him, the papers from Miss Carter's case still lay neatly stacked, untouched since the verdict. He didn't look at them. Instead, his eyes lingered on the empty defendant's stand, the place where arrogance had turned to humility and where judgment had become redemption. He leaned back slightly, exhaling a long, thoughtful breath. His voice, calm and measured, filled the silence, not directed to anyone, but to everyone. People come into this courtroom thinking they're here to face the law, he began softly, but sometimes they meet their conscience instead. His words carried the tone of reflection, the kind that only comes from years of watching humanity unfold in its rawest form. The law, he continued, is about right and wrong, but justice, real justice, is about understanding. The camera lingered on his face as he adjusted his glasses and glanced toward the window. Outside, a mother guided her child across the street, holding their hand protectively. The faint smile that touched his lips was more than contentment. It was hope. When I look at the people who stand before me, he said, I don't just see their mistakes. I see their stories, their struggles, their fears, their pride. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them that compassion isn't weakness. He paused, his gaze distant, thoughtful. You know, he said after a moment, we live in a world that's quick to punish and slow to understand. But every once in a while, if you give someone a chance, just one, they'll surprise you. They'll rise higher than the mistake that brought them here. He looked down at the bench, fingers tracing the edge of a file. That young woman, she came in angry, but she left changed, not because of a sentence, but because someone believed she could be better. The sound of a clock chimed faintly in the background. Caprio turned toward the camera, his voice soft but resolute. Respect is free, he said, but its absence can cost you everything. The light dimmed slightly as the shot lingered on his face, half lit, wise, unshaken. And as the camera slowly pulled back, the courtroom seemed to glow with quiet humanity. The gavel rested beside him, untouched, as if justice itself no longer needed sound, only silence and understanding.